Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erica Schiller, and I'm joined by my Climeco colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together. Hello and welcome everyone to ESG Decoded. My name is Anna Stablum and I work for Climeco as a business development director. I'm based here in Singapore, and with me today I have Professor Benjamin Horton, or Ben for short, and today we will look at the state of the world from a climate perspective. We will focus on Southeast Asia, as this is where we're based, and as this is a particularly vulnerable region in terms of climate change, we will go in and discuss a few of those topics in more detail. So welcome, Ben, to ESG Decoded. It's great to have you here.
Hey.
So Ben, you're a climate scientist. What does that really mean? And if you don't mind, could you please tell our listeners a little bit about the Earth Observatory here in Singapore and what you are doing there?
Well, I've been a climate scientist. Well, in fact, if I take that back, I didn't get into climate science when I was doing my PhD. I was just studying how the Earth changed in the past. And when you look at the Earth, at how it changed in the past, you want to see what controls it. And one of the mechanisms is climate change, be it the amount of radiation from the sun or the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They're the two sort of levers that control the climate on the Earth. And so if you understand the past, that provides data that can be used to project the future. So a climate scientist is someone who studies how the Earth works. And you can be what's called a paleoclimate scientist. They study the climates of the past. Or you can be a climate scientist that projects the future. And I've been doing this for 30 years. And I suppose I'm one of a very few group of people who's actually studied the past climates, study the present climate, and also studies the future. So I have a rather a unique perspective that I know what will happen to the Earth if we continue to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So my career, I started off as a PhD in the United Kingdom. I then moved over to the United States, become an assistant, associate and full professor. And then I came over here to Singapore and became the director of the Earth Observatory of Singapore. So this is a governmental sort of research think tank. And we look at geohazards, so earthquakes or volcanoes, and climate change that can destabilize Southeast Asia. So after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, the whole of Southeast Asia was decimated. And one of the problems is we didn't have the data to adequately prepare Southeast Asia for an event like that. And so Singapore thought it was their responsibility, because as a developed nation with deep pockets, but in particular having two world-class universities in NTU and NUS, that it was their responsibility to better prepare the region. And so EOS was founded some 16 years or so ago now, which means it's quite a mature institute. NTU as a university is only 30 or so years old, and Singapore's only 60. So, EOS has been around for the quarter of the history of Singapore. And it's made fantastic discoveries, which enables Southeast Asia to be more safe and more sustainable.
No, I love it. So we got the right person on the call today on the podcast to discuss climate change and especially the effects on Southeast Asia, because I think this is really a region that will take some of the brunt, it feels, when it comes to climate change, and maybe more so than some other regions in this world. But I would love to hear your opinion on that. But I wanted to also start off with at the beginning of this year, it's February now when we're recording this podcast, there was a lot of talk about the temperature basically breaching the very important level of 1.5 degree that we've been talking about in the Paris Agreement, a legal treaty that many countries have signed off on, and that we breached that threshold. Some people are saying it's just one data point, so you shouldn't really worry. What's your view on that? Is it a worrying data point, the 1.5 degree?
Well, climate communication is a big problem. And so for the vast majority of your listeners, I don't think they understand what 1.5 degrees C threshold is. Indeed, if you're an American, I don't even use centigrade. So what is that in Fahrenheit? I think it's a classic case of, scientists being nerds. We should have said that it's the threshold which plunges the Earth into an uncertainty, which means it can be the end of civilization. I mean, it's such a crucial threshold. And if you have a threshold in finance, you pivot. If there's a threshold in accountancy, you pivot. There's a threshold in healthcare, you pivot, or education. But climate, well, rock it off. I'd love to know whether anyone is doing anything different from January 2024 to January 2025, when we've crossed a threshold that scientists said you could not cross. Now, I was involved. So, the threshold was basically the scientific community had already projected temperatures and sea level rise and rainfall out to 2100 and beyond. And there are minor changes with that as science improves, but generally you put more CO2 in the atmosphere. If you double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, temperatures will go up 3 to 5 degrees C, and sea level will go up 1 to 2 meters, and you'll get somewhere in the order of about 15 to 24% water vapor in the atmosphere. And we've known about that for a long time. But what governments wanted to know was, is there a threshold? So we can continue to warm, but is there a hard line that we cannot cross? Okay? So we were asked as a community of this. And when I was in the US, the National Science Foundation wanted to know what the thresholds were of the ice sheets on our planet. So there's a group of people came together, looked at observations of the ice sheets, looked at paleopast reconstructions and modelling. And then basically we also found that it's quite curious, and a lot of the systems, they collapse after between about 1.5 and 2 degrees C, warmer than pre-industrial temperature. You have a baseline, which is pre-industrial, so that's just natural variability of CO2 or solar variability. And then the warming, we said, well, here's what the threshold is. And so Greenland is approximately around, when you get around 2 degrees C, it starts to melt. And in Antarctica, the West Antarctic ice sheet, which has about 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise in it, is around 1.5. And these thresholds, the important thing about these thresholds that's lost on people is once you've crossed them, it's like a runaway train. You can't stop it. You can, but it takes hundreds of thousands of years. So you don't want to cross it. So, they put together this report, and that goes through various policymakers, goes through COP agreements. And you have this policy that was released in Paris in 2015 that the world will not allow temperatures to cross that threshold. Okay, so we should be safe. And so we said, well, how do you do that? Well, again, it wasn't draconian. It was all about bending the curve on carbon dioxide. You were allowing the Earth to warm. You weren't saying you needed to cool it. We were saying we're allowing it to warm, and so you don't cross that threshold, and then maybe you can use technology to start to remove carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which we have no technology at scale at the moment, replenish our natural ecosystems, and you'd be able to return the Earth to stability. When we've had a combination of climate change and natural variability to enhance the warming of the planet, we cross the threshold. And I actually didn't think, in 2015, I actually didn't think that I would be alive when we crossed that threshold. I just couldn't understand how, if we communicated that you cross that threshold and all the coastal cities in the world flood, the ocean circulation could stop, all corals die, the Amazon becomes a savanna. When we look at populations, it's estimated that once you cross that threshold, between 4 billion and 7 billion people will not reach life expectancy. I was just like, well, we're not going to allow that to happen. A government or a big corporation or a philanthropic family, you're not going to allow that to happen. And here we are.
Here we are.
And here we are. And we crossed that threshold, and there wasn't a reaction from anyone except climate scientists completely and utterly freaking out. Like, we're in a complete mess because we didn't think it would happen. And now we've done it. We don't actually know what the outcomes are going to be. So I'm a sea level scientist by training. So if you went from climate, there are many elements. I'm a sea level scientist. And, not blowing my own trumpet. According to a survey that was done recently, I've published the second most peer-reviewed articles of sea level of anyone on the planet. And if you want to ask me what's going to happen to the ice sheets, I don't know. Do they collapse and cause multi-metre sea level rise in the next couple of decades, flooding every city and making every coral reef and every coastal wetland extinct? I don't know. Or are they going to remain stable for 100 years before they collapse? I don't know. I never thought I'd have to ask this question. Yeah. And so we're now scrambling around and you get differing opinions. Someone say, if you ask people at the British Antarctic Survey, West Antarctica's gone. Yeah. So-called doomsday glacier that acts like a plug on the whole of the Western Antarctica has gone. And we're going to get 2 to 3 metres sea level rise this century. Other people, there's been a recent paper going out saying, well, maybe more stable than we think. Ocean circulation is perhaps the most worrying. So, when you get above 1.5 degrees C, ocean circulation that transports heat from the tropics to the poles slows down or stops. When that happens, we kiss goodbye northwestern Europe. But we don't know. But then there's another group of scientists that are going like, whoa, maybe it'd be stable for a little bit longer. And that's the situation we're in climate science, is that we're now like going, we shouldn't be here in any aspect of common sense. If you care about yourself, you care about anyone, you care about your government, you can care about your business, you care about your family, you care about anything, you shouldn't be here because all the solutions are in front of us, but we've been unable to communicate the severities. As I said, a Paris Agreement. I'm as bad as anyone. I've been doing these talks about consequences of a 1.5 degree C world. Why am I giving a talk about that? No one's going to understand that title. I start off my talk by explaining it, but no one's going to come into the room because they're going to go, what does that mean? And really, you crossing a threshold where the Earth becomes unstable and has the potential for humans for it to be unlivable. When you cross that threshold, things happen that are unexpected. The wildfires in LA. It's unexpected, really, because it's a wildfire in winter. Why would you get the greatest ever extent of a wildfire in the cool period of the climate? And so something I put out on LinkedIn yesterday is just these indicators of that the Earth is out of control. We are in winter, and at the North Pole winter, the average temperature is minus 20 or 30 degrees. It's been that way for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. What is the temperature predicted for today? +1. It's above freezing at the North Pole in winter. Anybody who understands the Earth, that's like, that just shouldn't happen. And the consequences of things like that happening in the Arctic influences everybody because we're a connected world.
So we're in this uncharted territory at this point. We don't really know what's going to happen next.
No, we know it's not good.
I hear you.
Sometimes I have a real hard time dealing with it because, I'm full of all this knowledge of what happens to planet Earth. And if I really focus on it, it's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to control your emotions. And it's hard to switch off about it. But then you go like, what are you going to do? I mean, I'm a dad. Last year, I gave over, because I have to do an appraisal every year, I did 50 or so seminars. I don't think I may have influenced. In fact, today, well, maybe I do. I met a guy today at a meeting, and he said, "Oh, I saw you talk 2 years ago, and what you said influenced me so much that I've gone and bought an area of land in Asia that my family can escape to when climate change hits. It's an area of land where they can grow their own crops and they have their own fresh water supply." That's a bit of a severe reaction, but he listened to me.
Yeah, I hear you. I do think actually, and in that sense, we are not all in this together because he might have the money to do so. And many of us don't, correct? So in that sense as well, I do feel, and that takes us into this Southeast Asia, which is obviously one of the most populous regions of the world and not necessarily one of the highest GDPs. And people don't have that much money. Do you mind explaining a little bit what sets Southeast Asia apart, if anything, when we are now in this uncharted territory and we don't really know what we can expect? If you compare to Europe or the US, is it anything in particular that will have an extra severe impact? And I am thinking about the Philippines and people living close to on islands and not having the luxury of buying your own island that you can have fresh water and sit a little bit higher up. Because I do actually think that amongst my friends as well, we're all thinking maybe we can't stay here in Singapore. Maybe we have to leave one day. And is Europe a better place to be? I'm not sure. But what's your view on Southeast Asia in particular?
Every region of the world will have its problems with climate change, depending on, obviously, the trajectory of carbon dioxide and whether we remain above this 1.5 degrees C threshold long enough to cause the tipping points to happen. So if we were talking about ocean circulation, the worst place in the world to be regarding those impacts is northwestern Europe. If you're talking about huge mega storms, tropical cyclones or Cat 6 or even Cat 7, it's the Pacific and the coastline of Louisiana and Alabama and Florida. So every country or every region has its problems. But Southeast Asia, if I go back to the Earth Observatory of Singapore, Southeast Asia, if you include the other hazards, I would suggest is the most hazardous region on planet Earth. And one of the things at EOS that we are really worried about is what we would call a compound hazard. So you get a climate extreme combined together with a large earthquake or volcanic eruption. We've never had that. We can think about compound disasters. When we had the pandemic, obviously that was horrific. But we at the Earth Observatory of Singapore were so worried about an earthquake or a volcano happening because how would you get the relief, the aid agencies? So, Southeast Asia, we just think about earthquakes. It's had 4 of the 11 largest earthquakes ever recorded, most infamous being the 2004 Boxing Day event. If we think about volcanic eruptions surrounding Singapore, are 800 active volcanoes, which include the 2 largest eruptions of the last 1,000 years, Tambora and Krakatoa in the 1800s. When we get onto climate change, the 2 largest ever landfalling tropical cyclones occurred in Southeast Asia, Typhoon Tip in 1979 and Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. They both made landfall in the Philippines. And why Singapore brought me in from the US as a sea level scientist is, Singapore's very susceptible. A third of this island is only 1 metre above the highest tide. But in Southeast Asia as a whole, because it's an island archipelago, globally about 1 billion people are subject to a 1 meter sea level rise, but 70% of those exist in Southeast Asia. It's low-lying, high population density. So that's just the physical risks. Singapore has been sort of like excluded from weather extremes. It doesn't get tropical cyclones because it's at the equator, it's the doldrums. We don't get high winds. We don't particularly get high rainfall. We get constantly large rainfall, but we don't have torrential rainfalls because the monsoons don't get as far down as here. We also don't particularly get droughts, and we don't really particularly get very high temperatures. It's warm all year. The weather extremes we've been excluded from, and geohazards, there's not a volcano here, there's not an earthquake fault here. But on climate, of all the developed nations, we're just talking about developed nations that I've been to, Singapore's the most at risk, because climate change, the two things that we can predict the easiest is that temperatures will go up and sea levels will rise. And I'm not an alarmist scientist. If you want to go to the Singaporean government, NEA, National Environment Agency, has a very, very high resolution model. And they say under a high emission that within a few decades, that every single day in Singapore will have temperatures that are beyond the limits of human survivability. That's the Singaporean government. So when you say we'll have to leave, well, you'll either be under the water or you won't be allowed outside. So of course you'll leave. And I had this conversation today with members of the Singaporean government trying to say that, your country's at risk here.
Yeah, very much so.
I'm sorry. You said, you brought me on. I'm a physical scientist. This is, I'm not doomist. It's just reality.
No, this is what we all need to hear, I think, because this is obviously with very little change taking place, then this is yet another forum to have these discussions. And I do think that we might not know exactly how bad it might be, but it's bad enough already, I feel, sometimes when you even just walk outside in Singapore, it's 36 degrees, and we're starting to see those kind of very hot days already. And it's going quickly, it seems. The change is much quicker than what any scientist would have ever imagined, like you mentioned.
I agree. I think there's some feedback mechanisms that we just didn't understand. I think we didn't understand when you get externalities on climate. So you've got climate going on, and then you think, well, you've got natural variability, and then the feedback effects within those amplify the eventual temperatures, and then you've got to think about the impacts of those temperatures on finance, health, biodiversity. As I said, we're a little bit behind the 8 ball because we didn't think we'd be here. One of the things that I get a little bit frustrated is people going, well, we know the science. And I'm going like, yeah, we did, but there's a huge knowledge gap about getting beyond this 1.5 degrees C world. And we've desperately got to do that because we've got to work out how quickly we need to adapt. Desperately need to think about, mitigation. Obviously, reducing of carbon dioxide, we have to continue that. But adaptation is going to be key. But there isn't an infinite amount of capital. It's got to be spent wisely. How do we keep, the developing nations safe is going to be really crucial. It can be really difficult and really crucial. Because apart from being a human and wanting what's best for other people, if we don't protect them, we have huge problems with resources, food security, water security, energy security, and migration.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
A lot of challenges ahead. And this is supposed to be the decisive decade, right? So we came into this in 2020 and we thought, okay, we're going to have this runway to 2030. And here we are in 2025. And like you say, not a lot has necessarily changed.
Well, there's a huge movement on climate. We have had a civic movement on climate, especially amongst the youth. They're suffering from climate anxiety. It's the tragedy of the commons. They can't do anything about it. I don't want them to suffer from climate anxiety. So 2024 was the warmest year since records began. Indeed, we think 2024 was the warmest year for 120,000 years. 2024 had the warmest month in July and had the warmest day in July. It also coincided with the record amount of carbon dioxide emitted in any single year. So, we can look at positive elements to do with civic. We can look at positive elements to do with tech on renewables. We can look at positive elements in us understanding the value of nature.
It is very worrying, and you can understand that climate anxiety. I think we all suffer, the people that are working in this space, we're all suffering from that every so often. But what can one do? We've been talking about some of the governments obviously letting us down big time. Are there governments out there that, in your view, are actually doing the right thing? Or is there a possibility for single people like you and me to actually take action?
Yes, you can change your mode of transport. Yes, you can start to reduce, reuse, recycle. But, like when I switch my lights on here, I know that 98% of the energy mix in Singapore is natural gas. There's no alternative, yeah? So the individual's been put at fault. And then, if you fly, oh my God, you're the worst. But you have to live your life. You can do it more sustainably in thinking about combining your trips. If you go to Europe, you fly there, then you take the train and things like that. And that's great. And you're thinking about it. As long as you're educated about it, you think climate change shouldn't be about you having to change your life for the worst. Climate change is about improving yourself as a person. I am a better person because I've understood climate change, because I've understood the value of nature, both climate, but for my mental health as well as aesthetics. I've thought about my diet, because climate change, if you don't eat as much red meat, it's better, it's better for your health, better for your pocket. If you think about climate change and you change your thermostat on your air conditioner, it's better for the planet, it's better for your pocket. But I still have to have air conditioning on the hottest parts of the day in Singapore. And if you want to ask me what I would really like to eat tonight, would be a T-bone steak. But I'm not going to eat it every day because I'll save it for special occasions. And indeed, therefore, it tastes better. Yeah. I'm just saying, so the individual can do something and it should be positive. And then ultimately, if you solve climate change, you solve inequality, because it's about being a human being and doing something for those less fortunate than yourselves. We can touch on a lot of things, but that's what it's about. It's about equality, and so but the individual the individual can start to think clever. We've got to have better education. I really think we've got to, because education is power. So education, knowledge and power, but we've got to think smarter. If you really are truly scared about climate, consumer purchases, start to think about doing a little bit of work and think what you're going to buy, and is it a sustainable product, because then the market will shift towards that. Yeah. And then also, the vast majority of us in the world do have the power of the vote, and you vote on whether your local councillor or MP is going to keep your community safe. And I do believe strongly in the grassroots now, because our big organisations have rather failed us. And I've thought about that to do with the Earth Observatory of Singapore. So I thought we're great. We write all these world-class papers. We go to international conferences, we deal with governments. But what about civic society? We've done very little for Nanyang or Geelong. we should be going into the community centres and the church group, just saying, look, we're here, we're the experts, this is how we can help protect our local community. So, I mean, that's what I think the individual should be doing. I think it has to be a grassroots. We have to box clever, in this state of the climate. I've seen on LinkedIn, people saying, well, we need to double our efforts. Well, I'm sorry, I can't double my efforts. I'm already working at 100%. But I've got to think differently. I've said this a few times in a variety of meetings. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. And so for me, as a climate scientist, I've been doing the same thing and the same thing for 30 years, and it hasn't worked. So what am I going to do differently? What am I going to try? Will it work? I don't know, but I've got to try something differently. Me doing scientific reports and delivering them to the government, I don't think that that's what I want to do. What I want to do is more and more education to different stakeholders, not just traditionally what I would do, which is undergraduate or the graduate curriculum at university, but thinking about different communities. And then this thing about a civic society. I was brought up in a civic society. My dad is an academic, and he was an academic at Sheffield University, which is a civic university. And my dad, he was into photosynthesis and plant productivity. He used to, on a Saturday morning, educate the local public in the allotment on how to grow their green beans. I mean, he was a world-class scientist. He's now an FRS Fellow of the Royal Society, signed the same book as Charles Darwin, but he spent his Saturdays telling, Mr. and Mrs. Smith how to grow bigger carrots or keep their green beans fresher longer. And I just thought to myself, that's what I was brought up in. And what I should be thinking about is keeping people in Geelong and Nanyang safe.
I love that. What a nice way to end this podcast. I can't help but think that is really what might make us feel a little bit better about ourselves, at least, to vote correctly for the people where we have the right to vote for politicians that can actually work in favor of the environment. And like you say, to educate, go to schools. And you do see this, the school children, they love to talk about the environment and biodiversity and learn about these, of course, very seriously horrific kind of prospects as well that they're faced with. And it's tough in one way to talk, I find, with my own children about these issues, because it really can get you down there. But I think what you said, to work together as communities and to put pressure on the people that have a voice and have a mandate to decide. I think that's kind of what we can do.
I agree. I think it's also about protecting your own mental health. I cannot keep doing this. I was actually I was interviewed for an article by a young journalist who's writing a book about burnout. And she'd seen me talk and she was like, wow, this guy's going to burn out. How does he, he's talking about the end of the earth and he keeps talking about no one listens to him. It's classic burnout. He just talks more and more and more, does more. And then then there's me, but then there's the whole collection of me. I have a team of about 20 people who are studying sea level rise. And so, it's all about how do we feel better about ourselves? And so this thing about grassroots, we can make a difference at the grassroots, and you can see a smile or appreciation and people do things. It's also good for us because we cannot keep on getting pushed back because we'll just give up. So what we need to do is say okay, let's go down into the grassroots. Let's be people again. And if we can get that momentum going forward, all big changes in society have been done by civic movement. Gay marriage in the US, civil rights, women to vote, apartheid. It wasn't a government, social media star that did this. It was society. And so we've got to think like that. We've got to get people going together. And it is non-political. It's all about just your life. And we've got to educate people. The natural world, we can't exist without it. We've got to have a stable climate. And this is how you can have this groundswell of support.
Yeah, let's go out there, Ben, and bring those grassroots movements to bigger and stronger and working really hard for our environment and our planet. And like you say, there's no point in burning out on the road there. So it is staying together and keeping positive and finding those solutions. We didn't get to solutions today. There are a few solutions out there, obviously, that people are working on, and a few positive things, of course, happening as well when it comes to fighting climate change. But thank you, Ben, for sharing all your knowledge with our listeners on the ESG Decoded podcast. And it's been a pleasure to hear you speak. You can hear the passion come through, and it's we're all with you, if that's of any consolation. But and trying to do our best.
Of course it is. I mean, what I'd always ask of your listeners is, if you see a young scientist on social media talking about the science, just send an emoji to support them, because it means a lot, because you get a lot of vitriol back and you want to know that you're valued. And, someone my age, I've got a thick skin, but young people, they need your support. You need to know that these young scientists are very much needed.
Fully agree with that. And I hope you will send our regards to the people that work with you at the observatory, and that you continue to do the scientific research that you have done this far, and really enlighten us on your findings. So thanks again, Ben, for joining the podcast, and we hope that we will get together soon again.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit climeco.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.